Good morning, 3EB. Mrs. Heyman saying hello to you. I would say it's lovely to see you, but I can't see you. I hope it's nice for you to see me. And it's lovely that we've got this opportunity to try and communicate. So this is a bit of an experiment this morning. I want to see if this works. A way of greeting you, tuning in. We can hook up together. And I'm going to try to read you the rest of Stig of the Dump because we were only halfway through. So I hope you're all well and staying healthy and getting some fresh air in the way that you're allowed to do. Listening to your parents' advice, washing your hands, not picking your nose. You know who I'm speaking to. Luckily, for privacy reasons, I'm not going to use any names this morning. So yeah, we'll see how this goes, and then hopefully you guys can let me know whether this has worked and you've been able to listen to the next chapter of Stig of the Dump. So, if you remember, we got up to chapter 5 called the Snargits. We'd started it, I'd read a couple of pages of it, so I'm going to start from the beginning of chapter 5 again. If you remember, the Snargits are a group of boys, 3 brothers, it seems, who are from a family of, they're a bit cheeky, these boys, let's say. And at a certain point in the chapter, they'll tell you that they've got nicknames. One of them's the Lone Ranger, one of them's Robin Hood, and one of them's William Tell. All 3 of those character names, those nicknames, are fictional, legendary heroes in a way. One of them was a good cowboy. Obviously, you know Robin Hood. William Tell was a super archer, very good with his bow and arrow. They also later in the chapter refer to jelly babies, which is a type of sweet, which are a bit like gummy bears, but in the shape of little babies, which might sound a little bit strange, but they're very normal in England and they taste delicious. They also talk about sherbet with licorice sticks, which sherbet is a very sweet, sugary, fizzy powder that sweets can be made of, and it's sometimes in the form of a powder in a bag or in a tube, and traditionally you might eat it by sucking it up, a tube made out of licorice. So that comes up in the story as well, so hopefully you'll understand that when you hear it. There is also a little bit of smoking that goes on in this chapter, and I know that you know that that is not something that you should be doing or copying the Snargits. Okay, let's start. I hope you enjoy. If you don't want to watch me, you can just listen. Okay. The Snargits. Why don't you go out and get some fresh air, Barney dear? Do you know what? I need to put my glasses on, don't I, before I start? That is a better idea. Let me start again. Why don't you go out and get some fresh air, Barney dear? Asked Grandmother. Barney stood and looked out of the window. Doesn't look very fresh to me, he grunted. A yellow fog hung over the trees outside. The smoke from the back kitchen chimney stirred itself into it, and there seemed to be a smell of distant cement works. Never mind, dear. It's better than stuffing around indoors all day. All right, Granny, I'll go out, said Barney. After about 20 minutes, he had found his jersey, that's his jumper, mixed up with his bedclothes, one outdoor shoe under the bed and the other one under the chest in the hall. He wandered out into the garden. It was neither warm nor cold, and there was no wind at all. He made for the chalk pit, whistling and with his hands in his pockets. As he came near the edge of the pit, he stopped whistling and stood still. There were voices coming from the bottom of the pit. His pit! Well, perhaps it wasn't his pit. It didn't even belong to Grandfather. Or did it? Perhaps holes in the ground didn't belong to anybody. All the same, he was quite annoyed that other people should be poking around down the pit. He went cautiously to the edge and peeped over. Down there among the tin cans and other rubbish were 3 boys of about his own age, or older maybe, dressed in jerseys and trousers that were grubbier, dirtier, and more tattered than his own. They had grey tennis shoes with holes in the toes. They all had long, rather greasy hair, and Barney recognised them. They were the Snargit boys, part of a large family who lived in an old house with tarred weathered boards and were always getting into trouble. At least that's what the grown-ups said. But then, who didn't get into trouble? The Snargits seemed to be building some sort of shack for themselves out of dead branches and old sheets of corrugated iron, with a lot of horseplay and cries of, "Nah, not that way, Clever. Do it like this, see?" Barney crawled to a place where a twisted tree trunk grew from the very edge of the cliff. He hid himself behind it, broke off a handy-sized clod of clay and roots from the cliff edge. Then he hurled it at the roof of the shack. It curved through the air towards the target, but missed, and landed almost noiselessly on a mossy log. So Barney chose himself another clod. A clod is a chunk, and threw it. This time it struck the bottom of an upturned bucket and exploded like a little bomb, shattering bits of clay over one of the Snargits. "Here, who's chucking dirt?" cried the first one suspiciously. "I never," said another Snargit. "Must have been him," and he pointed to the third and youngest Snargit. "Leave off, will ya?" Oh, hang on, that's the old one. "Leave off, will ya?" said the first Snargit, "or I'll do ya, see?" "I never done nothing," protested the youngest Snargit. "Oh, you didn't ya?" said the first. "Nah, I never." "Well, don't you do it again, that's all." At the top of the cliff, Barney, the cause of all of this trouble, chuckled to himself and broke off another clod. This time his aim was true, and the clod landed fair and square on the sheet of iron, which is the roof of the shack, with a most satisfying clang. And anybody who's saying, "Oh, onomatopoeia word" from my L1 group, yes, you're right, clang. 3 Snargit heads popped out at once like ferrets out of rabbit holes. "I told you someone was chucking dirt," said the first Snargit. "And I told you it weren't me," said the youngest. They looked around, scowling at the floor of the pit. "All right, it's no use hiding. We can see ya," called the eldest Snargit. Barney hugged himself in silence behind his tree trunk. He knew this was just a bluff. They were just acting. They hadn't even looked in his direction. "It's old Albert, I bet," said the middle-sized Snargit. "He's been and followed us." "We can see you, Albert," called the first Snargit. "Come out of that bush, or we'll come and do ya." They were standing, looking at the far end of the pit with their backs to Barney. With great care, Barney broke off a clod as big as he could find and aimed it again at the roof of the shack. It hit and exploded with another loud clang. It scattered pieces all over the 3 Snargits, who ducked wildly and clutched at each other. And then they looked foolish at being taken by surprise. They whispered fiercely amongst themselves, pointing at places on the cliff edge. "Come from behind us, didn't it?" "Nah, he's up there, he is." "Don't be daft, he's over there in the bushes." "I tell you, I saw him." They were all pointing in different directions. "It's all right, Albert," called the eldest Snargit again. "It's no use you hiding yourself up there, 'cause we're coming to get ya." But this didn't worry Barney either. By the time they got to the top, he could be well away. The Snargits must have thought this too, because they actually didn't make a move. Instead, they went back inside the rickety shack. Barney scored another direct hit, and then a near miss. Each time, heads popped out and looked around fiercely, but Barney was too well hidden, and they failed to spot him. But there seemed to be a lot of whispering going on in the shack, And then all three Snargets came out and started walking towards the way out of the pit. The eldest called over his shoulder in a casual voice, "Goodbye, Albert," and the other two repeated it. "We're going now, Albert," called the eldest. "It's our dinner time. But listen here, Albert, we know you're up there. You just keep your hands off our shack, see? 'Cause we got something in there that's valuable. You daren't better meddle with that, that's all." The Snargets walked off towards the way out of the pit, whistling loudly and banging tins with their sticks. Barney waited until he could hear their feet on the lane dying away. That's funny, he thought. They've gone. Well, perhaps it is dinner time. He came out from behind his tree and went round the edge of the pit to the low side and walked along the bottom to the shack the Snargets had built. He wondered what the valuable thing was that they had left inside. There didn't seem to be anything except a paper bag full of chestnut conkers. "Silly old conkers," said Barney aloud. "They're not valuable." Perhaps they'd buried something. So he dug around in the mossy floor and unearthed a very rusty old tin box. It had writing on the outside. He could just about work out the letters. "Gold block," it said. It felt heavy. Should he open it or not? He decided he would. There was no harm in just looking. The hinged lid was rusted to the bottom and it wouldn't move. He banged at it with a stone, but out fell a rusty mass of screws, nuts, bolts, and curtain rings. Inside the lid of the box there was more writing, which said, "Gold block, finest pipe tobacco." Barney threw the tin away in disgust. It was just an old tin being reused. And then he heard a voice. "All right, mister, come out. We got you covered." It was the Snargets. They played a trick on him and crept straight back. He came out of the shack and faced the Snargets. One had a broken down old air gun, and the others were all pointing sticks at him. "Caw, it ain't Albert!" exclaimed the youngest Snarget. "We can see that," exclaimed the eldest roughly. "What's your name?" he said to Barney in the same voice. "Barney," said Barney. "What's yours?" "Well, I'm Lone Ranger, he's Robin Hood, and he's William Tell," snapped the eldest Snarget. "Golly!" exclaimed Barney. "Quiet!" snapped the first Snarget. "What was you doing in our shack?" "Yeah, and what d'you mean by chucking dirt at us?" asked the second Snarget. "Yeah, and what you doing in our dump anyway?" piped the youngest fiercely. "I can if I want to," replied Barney, pretending not to mind. But he wasn't really feeling very comfortable or brave at all. He was not sure just how rough these Snargets might get. "Can if he wants to, he says," exclaimed the Lone Ranger, as if he couldn't believe his ears. "What shall we do with him, fellers?" "Tie him to a tree and shoot him full of arrows," suggested Robin Hood. "Put him in the dungeon and leave him to rot," said William Tell. "Nah, I reckon we should string him up," said the Lone Ranger masterfully. "But we ain't got no rope," said Robin Hood. "Well, we ain't got no bows and arrows either, have we?" pointed out William Tell. "Well, there certainly ain't no dungeon around for miles, is there?" said the Lone Ranger. "Let's just give him a bit of torture, slow torture." "You wouldn't dare!" said Barney, but he didn't feel too sure. Oh, wouldn't we? Sneered the Lone Ranger. That's what you think. We often do, don't we, guys? We often do it all the time, don't we, eh? Give people the slow torture. Yeah, and then we shoot 'em, full of arrows, agreed Robin Hood. Yeah, and then we put 'em in dungeons, added William Tell. Well, I'd tell a policeman, said Barney. The eldest Snargit looked carefully around the pit. Would ya? Can't see no policeman round here, he said scornfully. Well, I'll tell my granny. She lives just up there, said Barney. And the Snargits collapsed in howls of laughter. He'd tell his granny, he says. Hear that, fellas? He'd tell his granny. They cackled with laughter, and Barney felt his face going red and tears started to come into his eyes. And then he thought of something. I'm going to tell Stig, he said calmly. The laughter went on. He's going to tell his Stig, cackled the Snargits. But Barney just stood there and smiled, and the laughter gradually died down. Who is Stig? The eldest Snargit asked suspiciously. Oh, he's a friend of mine, replied Barney airily. Ha! There ain't no such person, said the second doubtfully. Yes, there is, and he's my friend, said Barney. Where's he live? Squeaked the smallest Snargit. Here, said Barney. Here, ha! Chorused the Snargits scornfully. What, in the dump? Jeered the eldest Snargit, and they all laughed as if he'd made a joke. Go on, you don't half tell 'em, said the second. What's he do then? Tell us that. Well, he makes bows out of television aerials, and he makes arrows out of bits of flint, replied Barney. The Snargits gaped at him with open mouths. Look here, said the eldest at last. This here Stig of yours. What is he then? A boy? A man? Barney had to think a little bit before he answered, and then he said, He's a caveman. And again the Snargits burst into jeers and laughter. Yes, soppy old caveman. He's making it up. He's pulling our legs. He says he knows the caveman. Come on, fellas, let's do him in. Slow torture, they cried. But Barney leapt off the pile of rubble he was standing on and set off at a run towards the other end of the pit. The Snargits were after him with shrill cries. He's off! Get him, fellas! You chicken running away! Barney jumped fallen tree trunks and burst through banks of nettles without caring for the stings. He knew the bottom of the pit better than the Snargits, and he seemed to be leaving them behind. Then he heard the voice of the eldest. Take it easy, fellas. He can't get out of this end of the pit. Just spread out so that he don't double back. But Barney did not mean to double back. That means go back the same way. As quietly as he could, so that his pursuers, his chasers, could not hear him through the nettle banks and elder trees, he made towards the entrance of Stig's den, flung himself through the low doorway, collapsed, puffing, blowing, and pleased with himself, on the floor of the cave. Stig was there, making himself a really horrible-looking club, like a big stick with a solid end on it. He was using a tree root, and into it he was fixing bits of flint, broken glass, and rusty nails. Hello, Stig, panted Barney. Oh, I'm jolly glad to see you. But when he saw the horrible club that Stig was making, he almost began to feel sorry for the Snargits. Could he set this monster onto three little boys who really hadn't done anything to him at all? Maybe it was just a game they were playing. You never could tell with the Snargits. Barney just smiled uncertainly at Stig, and Stig returned him a friendly grin. Then from outside came the sound of the Snargets calling to each other. "Has he gone your way, Ted?" "Nah, I ain't seen him." "Must be hiding round here somewheres." There were sounds of the undergrowth being beaten and stones being flung into bramble patches. Stig listened and looked at Barney suspiciously, but Barney made signs to be quiet. "Caw, wait till I get my hands on you, Mr. Barney, wherever you are," came the voice of the eldest Snarget. "I'm covered in nettle stings down one side of my face. We're going to roll him in the nettles, aren't we, fellas, when we get him?" He sounded as if he meant it, and Barney started to feel not quite so sorry for the Snargets after all. Footsteps crackling on dry twigs sounded quite close to the den. Barney moved further back into the cave and made signs to Stig to do the same. But Stig stayed near the entrance, bristling. Suddenly, the voice of the youngest Snarget piped up excitedly. There's a knoll here! A knoll! Come out of it!" And a large lump of chalk came flying through the entrance and hit Stig smack on the side of his head. Stig gave a roar and charged out of his doorway. Barney threw himself after him to see what would happen. The youngest Snarget gave one pop-eyed, disbelieving look at Stig and turned and fled, sobbing and screaming. "Ah! It's a caveman!" The other Snargets, who had been closing in when they heard the youngest's cry of discovery, saw Stig and turned and ran too. And we've got a picture of that here that you can see, I think. "Wait for me! Wait for me! Don't leave me!" wailed the youngest, and then uttered a shrill scream of terror as he put his foot through the bottom of a rusty enamel basin and fell headlong. "Help! Help! He's got me! He's got me!" Almost as alarmed as the young Snarget, Barney ran up to where Stig was standing over the boy, who was shivering and moaning with fright and looked as if he expected to be eaten on the spot. But Stig was standing there, looking down at the fallen William Tell Snarget, with an almost fatherly look in his eyes. He bent down to help the boy to his feet, but the Snarget moaned feebly, Don't! Then, seeing Barney approaching, he turned his eyes pitifully towards Barney and wailed, "Don't let him hurt me! Don't let him hurt me! I wasn't doing any harm!" But Stig kept hold of him and led him firmly but gently towards his den. The Snarget gang, troublemakers though they were not as black as they were painted. They weren't the kind of people to abandon one of their men to his fate. And perhaps, too, they had an idea that violence was not always the way to get things done. Stig, Barney, and their captive had not been long inside the den before there came the sound of hesitant footsteps from nearby. Barney looked out, and there were the other two Snargets standing meekly together, unarmed, and holding paper packets in their hands. The middle brother also had a handkerchief, which might have been supposed to be white, tied to a stick, and he was waving it. Now, you might know that a white flag is a sign of surrender, we give up. So the other two Snargets have arrived with this flag made out of a dirty white hanky. "We got gifts," said the one with the white flag. "Yeah," said the other, "we come for the little un." Barney hesitated. "Well, you better come in," he said, "but no tricks." "Not likely," said the middle Snarget. "Not with that pal of yours there." They came in through the doorway, saw Stig for the first time close up, and stopped, their eyes growing rounder and rounder when they saw him. Then the second took a step forwards gingerly, holding out his hand with a paper bag in it. "It's for you," he said in a shaky voice. "It's jelly babies." Stig took the little bag in a puzzled manner, squeezed it, smelt it, and turned it around in his hands. Barney realised that though Stig was clever at a lot of things, he was sometimes surprisingly ignorant about such little things as paper bags. Then, as he turned the bag in his hairy hands, one jelly baby fell out onto the floor. Stig's eyes widened, and he stooped to pick it up. He held it tight to the lamp. He held it to the light of the lamp, which was flaming in the back of the cave, and Stig had a pleased expression on his face. Then he reverently stood the little sweet in a niche, that means like a tiny little hole, in the chalk of his den, when he stood back and looked at it. "Stig, you're supposed to eat it," said Barney, getting rather tired of all of this. "It's delicious." He went across to the jelly baby's little niche and popped it into his own mouth. Stig looked horrified, and Barney was afraid for a moment that he was going to hit him. "There's more in the bag, Stig," said Barney hurriedly, and he took the bag from Stig and opened it and showed him all the other little jelly babies inside. Go on, eat one," he urged. Stig took another between his finger and his thumb and put it slowly into his mouth. He chewed it slowly. Barney and the Snargits watched anxiously, and then a smile slowly began to spread over Stig's face. The Snargits, who had been standing there, strained and tense, sighed with relief and smiled too. Somehow everyone felt as though some very solemn ceremony had been performed. Barney handed around the bag, and all 5 of them seriously, ate the jelly babies. Then the middle Snargit produced his second gift, which was little bags of fizzy sherbet with hollow sticks of licorice stuck in them to suck it through. They sat down to this one. After a little instruction, Stig got the idea of how to suck the fizzy powder up through the little tube. But as soon as he got a mouthful and felt the unusual sensation on his tongue, he jumped up with an alarmed expression on his face and began coughing and spluttering, and the Snargits weren't sure whether to laugh or be alarmed too. But Barney banged Stig on the back, which impressed the Snargits even more, and managed to soothe him down again. Finally, with a flourish, the eldest Snargit produced a packet of cigarettes and handed them around. All 3 Snargits took one as if it was quite a usual thing. But this time it was Barney's turn to hesitate and wonder whether he should. As if he wished to show that they were friends now, Stig took one, beaming, and without even looking to see what the others were doing with theirs, he put his cigarette right into his mouth. The smallest Snargit suddenly exclaimed, "He's eating his!" And before they could do anything, Stig had chewed up the little tube of tobacco and swallowed it with great satisfaction. The Snargits and Barney lit their cigarettes at the lamp. Barney immediately choked on his and threw it away, and decided that smoking was not a very good idea. The smallest Snargit was puffing away, and he turned first white, then green. The other 2 smoked away quite happily, but Stig ate another one, but then couldn't be persuaded to send up in smoke what he considered to be rather good nourishing food. The Snargits began to feel at home in the cave. "He's all right, your pal, Stig," said the eldest. He don't say much, though, do he? Don't he speak English? Smashing place you got here, said the second Snarget. Love your spears. I weren't really afraid of him, piped up the youngest Snarget. I was just pretending I was. Yeah, and we weren't really going to do no harm to Barney here, were we, boys? It was all just make-believe, wasn't it, eh? We reckon old Barney and his pal Stig, they're all right, aren't they, fellas? The others agreed in chorus, and Barney felt a warm feeling inside now that the Snargets reckoned he and his friend Stig were all right. I tell you what, went on the eldest Snarget. Stig and Barney, they'll be part of our gang from now on, and we'll all swear an oath that we won't none of us tell no one about this den here. Barney was going to agree, and then he thought, well, it was his secret first anyway, so why should he swear about it with anybody? But the Snargets swore a horrible oath among themselves over the body of the last jelly baby in the bag, which they then cut the head off and buried to show what would happen to anyone who broke the oath. Barney felt fairly sure that his secret would not spread around the village now, and he felt somehow that Stig and the Snargets would get along very well together. Barney was quite surprised when he got back to his grandmother's house to find that he was in good time for lunch, and Granny was just dishing up dinner. "Did you find something to do outside, dear?" asked his grandmother. "It's not a very nice day." "Yeah, I had super fun with the Snargets, Granny. First I bombed them, then they were going to string me up or torture me or something like that, but I got away to Stig's den, and they thought Stig was going to eat one of them. But instead we ate babies. Well, jelly babies." "Oh," said Granny. "Aren't those Snarget boys rather rough for you to go playing with?" "Yeah, but they're nowhere near as rough as Stig. I reckon they're all right," said Barney. And that is the end of chapter 5. So I hope you enjoyed that, whether you watched, whether you listened. I'm hoping that our experiment works. And if so, I can do another chapter and we can go through the book or maybe use this YouTube for other things. So I wish everybody a good weekend in the hope that this arrives to you before the weekend. Say hello to everybody for me. I'm missing you. I'm enjoying being with my family, but I am missing normality, as I'm sure you are as well. But we're all in the same boat, and I'm sure everybody is making the most of all the positives from this situation. A bit more time with our family, less rushing around, and hopefully we'll see each other very, very soon. Okay, so I'm going to just turn this off, and then I'm going to get Mr. Heyman to try and help me get this sent off. See ya. Bye.